Adam Giannelli is the author of Tremulous Hinge, winner of the Iowa Poetry Prize, the translator of Diadem, a selection of poems by Marosa Di Giorgio, shortlisted for the 2013 Penn Award for Poetry and Translation, and the editor of High Lonesome, on the poetry of Charles Wright, a collection of essays on the poet's trilogy of trilogies. We're lucky to call Giannelli a local. He lives in Salt Lake City, where he's a doctoral candidate at the University of Utah. Tremulous Hinge is the kind of collection that I reach for when, like the speaker in the poem My Insomnia, I cannot sleep, when the day's weight lingers and I lie listening in the dark. For one, it's a sonically rich collection. With the simplest words, Giannelli can make us shudder. Even in poems where loss swims just under the surface, enjoying and sharing pleasure in words is partly what the poems are about. Like the speaker in Stutter, these poems retool language and deploy silence in order to say what cannot be said any other way. These poems tread gently into the world, asking the essential questions, and then trace quietly from image to image until they arrive, with startling clarity, at insights like this one. We live not with what never happened, but with what came close to happening. We are so lucky that this is happening today. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Adam Giannelli.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And thank you all for coming, and to Michael and the English department for hosting me. This poem is called Stutter. Since I couldn't say tomorrow, I said Wednesday. Since I couldn't say Cleveland, I said Ohio. Since I couldn't say hello, I hung up. Since I couldn't say burger, a waitress finished my sentence. A green striped mint dissolved on my tongue, from peacock to dove. Since I couldn't say my name, I opened, as if preparing for a throat culture. Since I couldn't say my name, I sat there. Since I couldn't say water, I drank. I could speak as camouflage, as in a Greek play or firing squad. So I stood in a row and pledged allegiance in chorus. Since I couldn't say dynamite, my mother drove me to hearing and speech each Tuesday. Since she knew I couldn't say butter the bread, she stopped on the way home for Italian ice at Corbo's. Since I couldn't say pistachio, I ordered hazelnut. I could say vowels, so I said, easy does it. I always said, easy does it. I said, all aboard. Since I can't say everlasting, I say every lost thing. Alone in my room, I can speak any word. Since I can't say memory, I say underbloom. And under me, a mulberry tree, a puddle shorn from the storm. I am a person who stutters, so if I get stuck on a word, please be patient. You can think of it as the dramatic pronunciation of enjambment. This is called Fern and Shadow. It's an ode to the body. This severed earth, a veined vapor. Its name is prunes easily in water. Its name, fern and shadow, an understudy, porous. On the subway, I hear the others lap against their collars, eyes closed, elbows to knees. A woman holds her head aloft in her hand. Lifting up his shirt, a man removes a bandage from a rash. Faithfully, it bleeds. These arms that coil at night, a nest, unravel in the morning, a narrative. This apology, asked to clench or coax, read or ruffle, to burrow or bury, this freight. Call it a body, if that helps you. Sea level. Last night I went back and removed all the angels from my poems. I singed their wings and gave them names. Now they wander the beach at Rockaway, sunburned, far from home. They fan out a towel in the breeze or lie until sweat alights on their foreheads. This close to Kennedy, the planes fly low enough for us to see the colors of the rudders. One crosses overhead, leaving a white girder in the sky. You say, but I thought TWA went out of business. Scintillate with white grit, the waves fall one after another, a perpetual curtain call. It's easy to say one word, field or flower, even geranium, but upright is two words yoked together. Say it in one breath. Home still falls before sick, sun before down. On the horizon sails white bevels glide. On the way to the bus, we squeeze paper cups so that lemon ice slopes over the rim. A group of men corral dominoes on a table. On the citronella candle, a flame glistens like the tip of a paintbrush dipped in amber. It fans out, flattens in the wind, brush on canvas. This next one is called Gravity. It's a poem about falling. It was written, it was at a time I actually fell and sprained my ankle, and then some other people close to me fell. So it's sort of about, it's about falling on earth, but then it's also about gravity in a larger sense. I was watching the Carl Sagan documentary, The Cosmos, and I think that was sort of one influence that came into the poem. Gravity takes under its wing a horseshoe, apple, the moon, bonds page to table, head to cushion, contriving a whirlpool, a spinning world, so that in water a penitence, in glass a mayhem, in pendulums constancy. Our love appoints its kingdom, but gravity does not elect or refrain. It effects its spell over hammer and feather alike, pebble and pedal, so each at the same rate falls. And baptismal, it can carry straight away, lofting in a wave, an entire person, whispers and all converted to a thud on the wet bathroom floor. Tired after work, too much weight, bearing down on one knee, the entire body carousels, a tilting and jilted mass, fluttering as pinion, as hum, as smoke rising from a candelabrum. The arms effervescent flare toward the sink, then the floor, to break the fall with the body's own. To bend to one will, we often say, but what if the will is already bent? As I walk out of Aleshi's, my bag of groceries rips open. To hunch is to orbit, to bend shadowy over tiles, skin, hair, and sleeves, bulbous as the tides. Even at my most poised, I am superposed, placed on the verge of entering or exceeding the earth, revolving around an ever-revolving orb, both of us circling one of the many bright minutiae in the universe, that dark effusion, boundless but still to an extent suggestive of embrace, There are no fragments, only wrinkles. When I hit the carpet, do not walk over me. Please, here. This next one is called Stargazers. I think there are only really 2 poems in the book about space and stars. And in the book they don't appear together, but I'm going to read them together for you today. Stargazers is kind of a pun. It's actually about stars that gaze, and not about people who gaze at stars. The way we look at the stars look at us and make constellations, not of our lives skittish, but our deaths dark and steadfast. In the morning, beneath the bedspread or under a bridge, each exit intrudes, an island in an archipelago of shadow. And the stars have a game of it, divining a pitchfork, a painter's easel, a wagon, a conglomeration called Madeline's hair. But sometimes the stars are hasty. For months a man lies in St. Vincent's after an inner cerebral hemorrhage, hardly moving, except to change the channel of a television in the corner or ask the priest to leave. Although faint, he's lined up in a row with 3 others in his wing to form the lip of a cup. The stars look and draw the constellation, its points in their almanacs, and then embellish it with emanating beams. They tell stories of how the cup was lost and sought by nights. The man rises once a day from bed and, clutching parallel bars, tries to walk in a room of mirrors. His point of the constellation wavers, and some insist he's a planet. Eventually he lets go for 3 steps, then for 5. Before the mirror, he rehearses greeting loved ones and strangers. And soon he's walking down Christopher Street towards the Hudson, the diameter of the cup widening farther and farther beyond all proportion. That's just a satellite, says one star. No, no, says another. It's too fast. Look at it falling across the earth. In the middle of the book, there are a series of elegies, primarily for my grandparents. So I'm just going to read a few of those now. The brunt of love. I've seen the word garnish the bottom of my letters. I've heard it spoken early, before the pawn shops roll up their iron gates and the sun rises bald and blood-colored, before the mouth is bidden, washed with salt water and left a listless harbor. But moments come when circumstance sets our affections, flushed and swollen, in absurd relief, against blankets, bars of soap, or the incandescence of Mercy Hospital, a wilderness in the blood. First she suffered a stroke, then grandfather dislocated his back, lifting her wheelchair into the trunk of a Cadillac. Along Woodhaven, the maples emit shades of yellow and green, like unripe limes. A siren bores through cold air. My eyes are bloodshot, as if set in small cages. I sent bouquets of tulips, daisy mums, then tea and dried apricots, when he could no longer lift the vase. Passage for Marjorie C. Giannelli, 1916 to 2000. Clouds thin to their bones, they sit but don't eat. Napkins tumble to the floor. The elms are stitched with white and unravel again on the street snow just fallen, is latticed by tire tracks. Nurses fold sheets, but there's nothing to harness. Absence isn't clear, it's a fine powder. It falls and lingers for days. A teacup, striations of letters, an unplugged television. On the grass, clumps of snow, like crumbs on a blouse, refuse to scatter. I throw salt on the pavement, my breath conspicuous in the cold, and watch neighbors bring in groceries as the sky darkens. Not lost, without a way, but a way is lost. The old oak barnacled with ice. O moon, you've made a hole out of white. This one is called On a Line by Proust. It's Villanelle, which is a fixed form. I'm not going to go into all the details, but as you'll see, it makes you, it sort of repeats certain lines. Silent now, the yellow house with its host of hiding places is gray. The true paradises are the paradises that we have lost. That line about the paradises is the line by Proust. It's in italics to mark it as a quote. The true paradises are the paradises that we have lost. We threw the geese bread stiff as toast, crenellating the loaf. We watered the irises. Those days are silent now. Without a host, the herb garden is overgrown. Like a ghost, mint lingers on the ground. Rosemary, basil, chives were my paradises. I have lost the rose that stretched when as the tallest I strode before the class, or toward the apse where into the silence the priest raised the host above his head. And now like the Eucharist, like Madeleine-laden tea, the taste of orange Julius contains the paradises we have lost. Those who called at me call from bed, dear Proust, or turn away to peck at sleep. Their memories are silent now, and I, the only host of the paradises we have lost. Little Winds for Benedict Egan, 1918-2013. This is sort of a longer poem in very short sections, so I'll just sort of pause between the sections. The cars on sunrise reduce to headlights. Above the King Cullen, the stars resume their old staring contest. Residence turned to reticence. In 1974, you published the 4 C's of outdoor advertising. I wonder about your ellipsis. Copy. It's so my grandfather worked in the billboard industry, so he sort of, if you wanted to put up a billboard, he was the one who sort of who you'd rent the space for. So that comes up in the poem, and then the 4 C's. So copy is one of the 4 C's, and the other ones sort of appear throughout too. Copy. In your old age, the mailbox became for you an event. I shall conclude, you wrote, at the end of a letter. The archaism was not meant to be prophetic, but ambitious. You never went to college. In your letters, too, ellipses rise like midges. Coverage. Shore Road in Bay Ridge, Luchow's at Christmas, the Rockville Lynx. You were their first Catholic. Montauk Lighthouse, the house on Roxon Road, where the third step from the bottom of the staircase would sound the alarm. All these years, I was hesitant to break away from the coals, and now the coals have broken from me. At the liquor store, we get boxes to disembowel the rooms. Circulation. Because of heavy snow, my grandmother's flight landed in Allentown. As she traveled by taxi to the hospital, you kept coursing. The candles on a cake reflect in your glasses, and each photo a flame of one sort or another lilts, and your image is the irreparable ash. The leaves in the grass bend into little boats. The elms are black easels. Continuity. I think your punctuation, a star field of dots and dashes, is because of the billboards. Anything to stand out against a white facade to speeding passers-by. This rage, I know. Even in your pamphlet, with those dashes, ends in a wreath, to impel and sell. That's a quote, and there are hyphens between the words. To impel and sell. We wait on the sod for the bagpipes, since you had ordered them for your eldest son and for your wife. This one is called Reflections. It's a series of chiastic strands. And it was in part influenced by the sort of anagram poems by Unica Zern, who did anagrams by the letter. But I tried that, and I found it impossible for me. So I did them by the word. Iris by the side of the house, inside of which I rest. On a moonlit summer night, under the sunlit moon. Feathers are in the air, a feat of theirs. Parents in the train window, winnowed to transparence. In a fog of forgetfulness, they forget the fullness of fog. The bouquet gives way, wind torn, wind born, away, the gift of a bouquet. Once our memory of it darkens, we'll no longer remember the dark. I touch you not to spar, but to spare your touch. To gather the pieces and piece them together. To turn to each other and hover between terms. And gently nest the shores of a shared emptiness. That one, reflection. So it's sort of the title, right? It refers to the form, and that they're kind of, each line is a reflection of itself. But then also the idea of sort of reflections, as in, sort of in terms of like thoughts, sort of like short epigrammatic statements. This one is called My Insomnia. This one is particularly apropos for me because my insomnia has come back in recent weeks. My insomnia unfolds itself like an ear and lies for a long time listening in the dark, or falls to its back, rigid as a shelf of coral. The only difference, my insomnia reasons, between its own predicament and fasting is resolve. Slipping a hand beneath the pillow, my insomnia abuts the cold. Some nights, my insomnia holds a flashlight under the covers, not to conceal the light, but to reduce the visible world to an amenable gleam. My insomnia is an avid reader and calls the bed Robinson's Island and the pillow Friday. My insomnia writes poetry, but confined to a world of light and dark, is prone to melodrama. My insomnia has its pride and never stoops to espresso or methamphetamine. It rolls out of bed, forward and unrepentant, into dusky latencies. My insomnia suspects that sleep is a form of genuflection. It drags a chair through the lawn and basks in the moonlight, convinced that the constellations are slowly sliding past each other like tectonic plates. It delights in crosswalks, pinball machines, snow plows, anything else with a checkered glow. It likes to drive, although it has never heard the sound of traffic. My insomnia takes the car out on the highway past the city's nimbus, where the landscape would be unintelligible if not for place names. Once it wanted to visit an aquarium, but had to settle for a casino with live dolphins. Defined by a lack, my insomnia shies away from its own name, but is yet to arrive at another. At the mention of sleep, my insomnia pretends to understand. Confronted with the slow quake of others slumbering nearby, my insomnia lets them drowse, sad to discover that sleep contains its own fits and vociferous cries. Despite such intimacies, my insomnia remains a virgin. As it brushes its teeth, it wonders if it is ticklish. My insomnia looks into the windows of restaurants after they've closed, when the chairs, like a herd of elk, are stacked atop the tables, each distinguished by its antlers. It peers into an antique store, inside of which a solitary light abides, suffusing the sherbet glasses and amber bowls. My insomnia has returned several times to see the same porcelain vase. It regards warm baths, chamomile, and Ambien as bribes, but receives them out of politeness. Sometimes my insomnia lies with its feet on the pillow, not out of irreverence, but desperation. My insomnia asks me what falling asleep is like. I say, like your shoelaces loosening. Once, my insomnia started to drift away, but could not bring itself to part with the spider in the corner, adding more white lilacs to a flimsy bouquet. One time I read that poem, and someone came up to me afterwards and said, "Valerian tea." But I tried it, and it didn't do anything for me. So it's not in the poem. This one is called Porcupine. Into pelt and sheen, Radden's bond, tight slatted, at rest, sheathed from the front. It is wickerwork, canebrake, quiver of arrows. But when provoked, it erupts, as bayonets, asterisks, threshing floor, Cupid in a fury. Its strategy is not precision, but exuberance, a wiry boast. Let the arrows fly, gold with lead, fluorescent quilled in dark makeup, like the bass player in an 80s band. It announces its eccentricity, then fades, making meager its own spotlight. But no porcupine can shoot its quills. So as in any romance, its pierce depends on flair and proximity. Maligned by lumberjacks and commuters alike, it has been maimed, poisoned, and shotgun blared. They do not accommodate you. your salt drive, your night sleuthing, your implacable whiskers. But we all have unlidded nights. We all have thorns. The same gaze that forgets the rose's quills makes a bonfire out of yours. But thorniness is no more than an erratic smooth. Your paws are polished and pebbled, the underside of your tail mildly bristled to gain purchase as it barnacles in the branches. Above the tail appears a bald spot with shorter barbs, a meadow, a rosette that, like an open flower, broadcasts a pungent aroma, a warning that accompanies the splayed quills. I choose you, my escaped convict. You run with your stripes still on you. Although you're slow and nearsighted, when you unveil your ribbons fan-tailed, I feel as though I am entering light speed. From out of the bare serene, the stars all striate, and you arch in monochrome, like a rainbow above a distant hill in a silent film. Those two, Porcupine and My Insomnia, in the book they appear back to back. Since I thought, I don't know, as someone who has insomnia, I think I felt a certain sympathy, or I don't know, connection with the nocturnal porcupine. And then this one, I think Porcupine also kind of pairs with this next one called Hydrangea, since they're both sort of odes. Water vessel, patina of summer. Its zeppelins soar all the way into September, the heads colored like the flavored ice atop snow cones. Beside a driveway and a house, a few orbs, flamingo-like, float on thin stalks. Others laden with bloom rest, like tails of tired poodles, on the ground. Each mop head is a bevy, a beveled blue, a standing ovation that fumes with lattices of spume, solid but fretful, like sleep. I never knew that ecstasy could arrive at so many angles. These breakers compass an entire globe. Coming to fisticuffs, each shrub clenches nebula and knuckle. Its bicep bulges, its big kahunas, composed of a chorus of florets, cups of 3 or 4 petals, flaring sepals that abut like umbrellas, or moths all swarming the same light bulb. Like a cloud formation, touching ground, the hydrangea offers no conclusion, only a deckled edge, and flocks toward the edges, coveting coastal climes, shade-wrangled soil, dappled light. Rilke wrote 2 poems, but you hold blue and pink in the same body. Your bloom's pigment pliant can change from one year to the next, from salmon to mauve to blue. Bearded lady, balloon man, chameleon, you make of yourself shoreline, ebbing and eddying with creams, cobalts, or mosaic, piecing together lavender and lilac, and so insist that where there is gradation, there is bounty. I learned from you to place the most generous part first, to complicate always with yet another fold, to contain more than one name. The distinctions between one cultivar and another are so faint that confronted with a single plant's corrugations, its swath of lily pads, it can be near impossible to surmise its name. Blue bonnet, Hamburg, seascape, Ave Maria. You can be willed more blue or coaxed toward pink so that your florals become not predestined but a destination. With aluminum sulfate in your soil you blue, and with lime blush. Rabid for reds, I station a plant because of the lime in cement beside a concrete path and watch as it bursts into flames. A tulip is singular, solar, on its stem, but you honeycomb and bouquet. Powder blue and pink spheres appear on the same shrub, so that a solar system it holds within its sway, a Mars and Venus. And there floats a single orb, amidst revision, half blue, half pink, marbled, nursing the shades, from dawn to high noon, proliferating with roiling waters, airy inlets, continents, craters, peninsulas of cloud, converting like a bivalve shell, difference beyond mere border, into the cradle of a vast and viscous muscle, all to make, more dutifully, a world. I realized that one also has some space imagery, so when I told you I only had 2 space poems, I lied, apparently. But Gravity and Hydrangea were written around the same time, so maybe so maybe that makes sense. This will be the last poem. It's called Plea for Interlude. I only ask that there are moments when the sponge, desiccate, rests on the counter like an empty pedestal, when the floors are swept bare and rain is held in the leaves like a letter written but never sent, furs of grace when the knife sits by the bread, the pink salmon is consumed by white paper, and the ring shimmers beside the sink, forced from its finger, the hovering hour when the last sheet, so vast it takes more than one to fold, lies flat in the cupboard, so that only a spider on the sill insists. And while the windows turn so dark, they become doors. My breath erupts into my breaths. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Here?
What's poetry for?
So the question was, what's poetry for?
You could tell that Charles Wright story.
Yeah. So before the reading I was telling Michael how when I studied at the University of Virginia with this poet Charles Wright, who then became poet laureate, and I had watched online an interview with him where a reporter when he was poet laureate asked him what I think it was something like that, what's poetry for, and he ended up saying, he said, because he has a cabin in Montana that he goes to in the summers, and he said that when he was in the summer in the cabin, he knew someone was going to ask him this question, and he says, like, I thought about it, and I have an answer. I don't know. And that was his answer. So I think he was saying that, it doesn't necessarily have a use value, that it's not for him, it was something very important, but he wasn't sure out in the world how it would sort of be necessarily useful to all people, and so I guess I thought that was a good answer, so I'm not going to expand upon it. But are there other questions? I think that I was always sort of drawn to language and using language, and I think that was my sort of initial interaction with poetry, was sort of I think it's sort of interesting as a person who stutters. I think maybe initially I was drawn to writing because it was on the page and it was a way to sort of express oneself in a way that that was not speaking, although I'm speaking in front of you all. But it was also, I think, also sort of I was always sort of very hypersensitive to language growing up, and so that was, I think, something that also sort of drew me to to poetry, because it's right. It's an art form where it's sort of in some ways communicative, but also interested in sort of using sort of language as a material. And I think that's something that always drew me to poetry. The first one that I ever remember, I think, was in 7th grade. I took a class, and we had to write poems. And I wrote all I remember is I wrote a poem about candy, and I rhymed candy with dandy, something like candy. It's dandy, and that was I think the first poem I ever remember writing. But also in high school, I wrote poems. Sort of interesting. I had this sort of high school English teacher who was also the wrestling coach, and he was kind of a big guy. And I remember he liked some of my early poems. Actually, one of the first assignments he gave was a ekphrastic poem, a poem sort of based on a work of art. So I wrote a poem about a landscape that I think it was very a very Charles Wright poem, and that it was I think a landscape of Montana, and that was a poem I wrote, and that was a work of art I used. But then I was very shy, and he wanted me to submit the poem to the high school's literary journal, and I didn't, because I was too shy about publication at that point. And he found out, and I remember he kind of accosted me in the hallway and kind of got into my, as your sort of sports coach would do, kind of got confronted me and got in my face and told me I needed to submit my poem to the journal. And so I was intimidated, I think, into my first poetry publication. So I sent the poem into the journal, and it was accepted. And then I think also in high school I was also encouraged, although perhaps more sort of directly than I was prepared for at the time. Other questions?
So your poems, as Wyatt mentioned, are very textured in sound. They have a great music to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just curious, are there poets you read that taught you music, or is it something you developed through certain practices? How did you come to having that in your poetry?
I think it was, for whatever reason, it was always something that I was interested in, and so I think I think it came. So sure, I was drawn to someone like Hopkins, who is very sort of sound based. I like Niedecker is a poet who, so I think is sort of, I appreciate the sound in her poems too. So I think, I'm not sure, it was I think sort of I was always drawn to it. So when I saw it in people's poems, it was sort of, it was something that I appreciated. But I think it's always been an interest. But those are some people I would cite as influences. Here.
Well, many of the locations in your poems were familiar to me. Where are you from?
Oh, I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. I don't.
It's like Rockaway, Montauk.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Okay, so I grew up in Cleveland, and so that first poem, Stutter, references Cleveland and even some sort of Italian bakeries in Cleveland. But my parents are from Long Island, and I lived in New York for a while. And so the book also, it does reference Long Island. So that poem, like my grandfather, lived he lived in Brooklyn, and then he lived in Long Island. And so that poem that's sort of about his life references sort of that landscape as well. Is that where you're from?
Yeah, I'm from Jersey.
No, New Jersey. Yeah. So I think it's a landscape that I'm familiar with, but I originally grew up in Cleveland. there were some other, here we go.
In your introduction, it talked about how you've done some translation of poetry.
Mhm.
How do you preserve like the essence of a poem across languages?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, that touched on something that Michael and I were talking about right before the reading, because he has an interest in translating from Russian, and we were talking about this essay that Nabokov wrote that was about his translation of Onegin and sort of all the difficulties that he encountered, which sort of takes the stance, that translation is ultimately pretty much an impossible endeavor. And so I would agree with that it is, you're trying, if you want to be truly faithful, then you're trying to be faithful to the sort of sense of the poem, but also its sound and its syntax and its line breaks. And so you sort of have all these variables that it's impossible to sort of reproduce them all faithfully in a sort of different language. And so you ultimately have to make choices, I think. And I don't always, you could, I guess, say, I'm going to just, there's some such thing as a sort of a homophonic translation, which is just where you just try to translate the sound. Or you could do like a prose translation of a poem that seems to be mostly just interested in the sense. But I try to sort of actually do my best to sort of try to, bring as many of those variables into English. So I probably don't focus on sound, but it's not something that I ignore. And so I think you kind of have to come up with different versions for any passage. You come up with different versions, and they all kind of fail, but you decide which one you think sort of fails the most successfully or beautifully. So it's sort of, I think, an effort of sort of failing. You try to fail sort of, beautifully. But I'm okay with that, because I actually think that's sort of what poetry is about too. I think you're always trying to write, sort of, I don't know what a successful or perfect poem is. So I think the act of sort of writing itself is also sort of an act of failing. Other questions? Well, thank you very much.